throne can be stormed. Palace can burn. A dictator can be named, cursed, mocked, overthrown, and pinned to history with a single face. Visible power has always offered civilization a target. Kings wore crowns. Emperors stamped their profiles onto coins. Caesars, sultans, commissars, and strongmen ruled through symbols large enough for a crowd to recognize and fear. Their authority was personal, dramatic, exposed. But one of the great transformations of modern history is that power did not perish when crowns were broken. Changed form. It became quieter, colder, harder to seize. In place after place, sovereignty stopped appearing chiefly as a man on horseback and began to arrive as a regulation, a stamped paper, a closed archive, a delay without a face, a command hidden inside procedure. The old tyrant could stand on a balcony. The new ruler often sat nowhere that history could easily point to. It lived in offices, departments, files, minutes, and memoranda. A ministry rarely inspires the primitive terror of a royal guard, yet it can govern more continuously than a king ever could. Professor Adrian Lockewell here, and this is the riddle at the center of the modern state. The familiar story says that liberty advanced by pushing aside monarchy, arbitrary power, and personal rule. That story contains truth. But it is not the whole truth. Beneath constitutions, elections, and representative institutions, something quieter may have inherited the throne. Few writers diagnose that shift with more unsettling clarity than Gustave Le Bon, who lived from 1841 to 1931. He is remembered above all for The Crowd, published in 1895, a book that made his name by probing the strange chemistry of mass emotion. Yet, for the architecture of modern governance, the more provocative texts are The Psychology of Socialism from 1898 and The Psychology of Revolution from 1912. In those works, Le Bon turned away from the sudden violence of the street and toward a slower conquest, less theatrical than revolution and often more durable than it, the growth of officialdom. His key term was fonctionnarism. It does not mean administration in the simple sense that every large society needs officials. It names a broader condition, the rise of a permanent administrative class that accumulates influence beneath the spectacle of politics. Cabinets change, parties quarrel, parliaments dissolve, ministries endure. The class that inhabits them does not need to abolish constitutions or announce a coup. It gathers power through continuity, technical language, procedure, memory, and survival. That is the paper sovereign. This is why modern political history can flatter itself while missing its own sequel. The usual sequence is told as a march from personal rule toward law, citizenship, and representation. Nothing in that sequence is imaginary. The correction is not that liberty was meaningless, but that liberty arrived alongside a new concentration of practical power. The minister appears and disappears. The file remains. The majority rises and falls. The archive persists. A speech proclaims policy. A department decides what that policy will mean once it enters the bloodstream of daily life. Power, in other words, began to migrate from the visible summit of the state into the enduring machinery beneath it. That tension can be carried through the entire inquiry in two terms: the unitary executive and the permanent administration. The unitary executive is the visible center of command, the office that the Constitution recognizes, the office the public can praise, condemn, or replace. It is the presidency, the premiership, the cabinet, the crown acting through ministers, the formal will of the state. The permanent administration is something different. It is the long-lived apparatus under that visible peak. Career officials, bureau chiefs, legal drafters, inspectors, clerks, archivists, departmental specialists, and all the offices that outlast elections and remember what transient governments forget. One claims direction, the other preserves continuity. In theory, the relationship is simple. Authority decides, administration executes. But history is rarely so clean. The institution that governs most effectively is often not the institution that speaks most loudly. Real power belongs, again and again, to the body that can store memory, classify facts, define categories, interpret commands, draft language, and slow or accelerate execution. A sovereign who cannot make the machine move possesses majesty without mastery. An office that cannot publicly declare itself supreme may still shape reality more deeply than the politician who stands at the podium. Le Bon matters because he grasped this civilizational mutation without reducing it to melodrama. He did not foresee every modern development, nor should he be turned into an oracle of every later administrative system. His value lies elsewhere. He saw that modern power was becoming less personal and more impersonal, less spectacular and more procedural, less concentrated in one commanding will and more sedimented in institutions that govern through routine. He understood that a people could cast down a king and still become increasingly managed by mechanisms too diffuse to hate and too permanent to dismiss. This is not a partisan fable, and it is not a conspiracy tale. The rise of officialdom was not simply the work of villains hiding behind oak doors, nor was it merely the innocent triumph of rational coordination. It was a historical adaptation to complexity, scale, industry, mass society, and the demand for continuity. Yet every adaptation carries a price. The more power dissolves into impersonal administration, the more difficult it becomes to see who truly rules, where decisions harden into commands, and how responsibility slips from public grasp. Anonymous rule has one immense advantage over visible rule. It can become ordinary, can sink beneath notice. Citizens may despise politicians while obeying procedures that shape life far more steadily than any speech or election. The crown was removed from the head, but sovereignty did not vanish. It descended into paper, and paper does not rule by charisma. It rules by training, certification, routine, and habit. Long before the office could become sovereign, the schoolroom had to begin manufacturing the human type most fitted to serve it. The machinery did not rise simply because rulers hungered for control. It rose because 19th century Europe was becoming ungovernable by older, personal methods alone. Population swelled, cities expanded, industry compressed human beings into new forms of proximity, and whole regions were pulled into rhythms no village notable or provincial patron could reliably command. What had once been handled through custom, deference, and local mediation now arrived as a constant pressure of scale. Crowded urban life brought epidemics, sanitation crises, food distribution problems, labor conflict, and policing demands that could not be answered by prestige or habit. Cholera ignored inherited privilege. A strike could disrupt an entire district. A failed harvest or a transport bottleneck could become a political event. The modern state was judged less by ceremony than by whether it could register births, collect taxes, move supplies, enforce contracts, vaccinate populations, and keep a restless society from breaking apart. War made the lesson harsher. The age of mass conscription turned population into a strategic resource, and a strategic resource had to be measured. Armies now depended on census categories, reserve rolls, medical examinations, transport coordination, procurement chains, and records that could survive the death or dismissal of individual officials. A kingdom that could not count its young men could not field them. The faster men, goods, orders, and capital moved, the more states required a durable apparatus capable of fixing them in reports, schedules, files, and categories. Taxation followed the same path. Pre-modern rulers often survived through exemptions, negotiated privileges, rough assessments, and the mediation of local elites. That older flexibility was poorly suited to industrial warfare, public debt, national infrastructure, schools, and expanding state obligations. To extract revenue from a modern society, a government first had to render that society legible. Land had to be surveyed, trade recorded, property classified, movement monitored, and income approximated with ever greater precision. Paper was not a decorative accessory of power. It was the means by which distant populations became visible to capitals. Archives were becoming instruments of strategy. The ledger and the census stood beside the rifle and the railway as foundations of the modern state. The continental model carried the unmistakable shadow of Napoleon and the regimes that followed him. France in particular demonstrated how centralization could survive changes of dynasty, constitution, and ideology because it answered a real administrative problem. Napoleon had fused military urgency to codified law and a chain of appointed officials that reached deep into local life. Prefects, ministries, uniform procedures, and a center determined to see the whole territory at once created a template of formidable endurance. Even governments that rejected imperial ambition often retained the administrative form. In France, this habit of central capacity matured further under the French Third Republic. School expansion, secular instruction, census-taking, military preparation, and the steady extension of official oversight reinforced one another. Republican politics widened participation, yet daily governance relied on an apparatus whose continuity had to exceed elections. That continuity was the great promise. In an era of cabinet instability, parliamentary upheaval, ideological agitation, strikes, and financial shocks, bureaucracy offered something close to political permanence. Ministers came and went. Files remained. Assemblies argued. The file outlived the minister. The procedure outlived the parliament. That achievement should not be dismissed with easy contempt. Large modern societies did require administration. Later thinkers such as Max Weber would describe rational bureaucracy as a functional necessity of complex life, a form of rule based on office, record, specialization, and calculable procedure. In that sense, Weber saw clearly what many critics preferred to ignore. Without administrative coordination, mass society would not become freer, only more chaotic and vulnerable. Le Bon's objection struck a different point. He did not deny the need for administration. He feared its overgrowth, its psychology, and the kind of human being and social order it might quietly produce. The question was never whether Europe needed clerks, inspectors, registrars, and ministries. The question was what happens when a coordinating instrument becomes a permanent social environment, then a career ideal, then a moral norm. Empire intensified the same logic. Colonial rule required maps, port regulations, correspondence, categories of race and labor, production reports, and a constant translation of distant societies into forms legible to metropolitan offices. At home, labor inspectors, public health boards, police administrations, and school systems expanded not merely because elites wished to command more, but because industrial societies increasingly demanded order, safety, and predictability. Even mass suffrage did not lighten the burden. It enlarged it. As more citizens became politically relevant, more citizens also became administratively visible. Rights, duties, schooling, service, and identity all required documentation. Mass politics and mass administration were not natural enemies. Very often, they advanced together. Yet, the very strengths of the machine concealed a future difficulty. Systems built to regularize life gradually favor what can be standardized, certified, and repeated. Institutions created to master disorder begin to distrust what arrives without precedent or cannot be neatly tabulated. Once a society requires ever more offices, it must also produce ever more occupants for those offices. The problem therefore shifts almost imperceptibly from state necessity to social formation. The expanding administration needed more than budgets and decrees. It needed a population trained to think in examinations, credentials, classifications, and secure appointments. The ministry was growing, but the deeper revolution was already underway elsewhere. In the classroom, in the examination hall, and in the long manufacture of a class prepared to live by paper. What the expanding state required, the schools increasingly supplied. Not merely literacy, not merely competence, but a social type fitted for examinations, paperwork, and official recognition. Gustave Le Bon gave that type a memorable name, the demi-savant, the half-scholar. The phrase was provocative, but its target was precise. He did not mean a fool. He meant a person genuinely educated in a narrow way, trained in abstraction, theory, formulas, and verbal performance, yet often detached from the habits of productive practice that industrial society demanded in workshops, firms, laboratories, transport networks, and commercial life. The danger, in his view, was not ignorance. It was partial formation. In The Psychology of Socialism, Le Bon argued that the educational prestige of France, and more broadly of the Latin model, concealed a structural weakness. The system rewarded elegant language, legalistic reasoning, memory, classical references, and success under examination. It was superb at certifying those who could reproduce approved knowledge under controlled conditions. But a civilization can become highly efficient at producing examinable minds while remaining far less capable of producing initiative, adaptability, or tolerance for uncertainty. That was the core distinction he insisted upon. Abstract book learning and practical economic adaptation are not the same achievement, and a society that confuses them invites disappointment on a mass scale. This criticism was inseparable from the 19th century that produced it. Europe was being remade by industry, railways, urban expansion, empire, and mass politics. Old social hierarchies had been damaged but not erased. New ones were being built, often through diplomas, examinations, and state-certified respectability. For families climbing upward, education seemed more than instruction. It seemed like an orderly path into dignity. A son sent to the lycée or university was not simply being taught. He was being invested with expectation. The diploma became a secular pledge that sacrifice would be repaid in status. That promise was not fraudulent. It had real foundations. Modern states needed administrators, teachers, lawyers, engineers, inspectors, and technical specialists. Broader schooling was not a mistake. It was a necessity of large societies. But the promise carried an instability within it. Educational institutions could multiply candidates faster than the economy could multiply honorable positions. Examinations could certify aspiration in enormous numbers. They could not guarantee absorption. The result, as Le Bon saw it, was the growth of an intellectual proletariat. A swelling class of graduates, minor professionals, unsuccessful scholars, and office-seeking aspirants whose education had elevated their expectations more rapidly than their circumstances. That phrase, intellectual proletariat, mattered because it revealed a shift in the social problem. Industrial society was not producing only factory discontent. It was also producing credentialed frustration. A man could possess schooling, titles, and cultivated speech, yet remain economically insecure, professionally stalled, and socially embittered. He had learned to regard himself as superior to rough manual life, But the order that had taught him this superiority did not always provide the post, income, or recognition that would make it real. He lived between rank and reality. Here, the demi-savant becomes psychologically important. The half-scholar is formed not only by what he knows, but by what he has been taught to expect from what he knows. Once credentials spread, their power changes. A distinction that once marked rarity becomes common. A title that once opened doors becomes merely preliminary. Each new cohort enters believing it has acquired leverage, only to discover that the currency of prestige has been diluted. Credential inflation is not an abstract policy concern in this story. It is an emotional engine. Converts obedience into grievance. The graduate has done what the system demanded, accepted its disciplines, passed through its rituals, and still finds the promised elevation postponed, narrowed, or denied. France offered Le Bon a particularly sharp example because school prestige and administrative prestige reinforced one another. The educational ladder prepared minds for the very language of ministries, faculties, examinations, and official careers. Success meant fluency in the values of supervised judgment. One learned how to satisfy examiners, how to align with categories, how to seek advancement through authorized channels. Such training could produce intelligence of a real kind, but it did not necessarily produce commercial courage, inventive resilience, or comfort with failure in open competition. The system excelled at forming candidates. It was less reliable at forming risk-bearing actors. That does not make Le Bon an infallible guide. His language carried the biases of his era and of his own social fears. He could sound disdainful toward democratized ambition, too eager to treat broad educational hopes as sources of disorder, too confident in rigid social types. Those limitations matter. A modern society cannot function by preserving ignorance in the lower and middle ranks, and the expansion of literacy, technical training, and civic knowledge was historically indispensable. The railway age, the industrial city, and the mass electorate required more education, not less. Even so, the lasting force of his observation lies elsewhere. Schools do more than transmit knowledge. They distribute honor, rank, expectation, and a map of respectable futures. When that map ceases to match economic reality, disappointment does not remain private. It becomes social material. A class emerges that is neither traditionally rooted nor securely placed, neither excluded in the old manner nor fulfilled in the new one. It is educated enough to aspire, but not positioned enough to rest. That is why this chapter in the story matters. The demi-savant is the human product of a civilization that expanded instruction faster than it clarified purpose. Lecture halls release candidates into a narrowing passage. Diplomas accumulate, applications multiply, waiting rooms fill. The queue becomes the true classroom of modern disillusionment. Too many applicants, too few offices, too many educated expectations pressing against a bottleneck of respectable employment. And in that pressure, a decisive preference begins to harden. Exposure starts to look intolerable. Security begins to look like salvation. Certificates had multiplied faster than places worthy of them. The school had trained memory, fluency, and deference to examination. Yet the market demanded something harsher: judgment under pressure, practical adaptation, and the willingness to stand alone when a decision failed. Across late 19th century Europe, many educated young men left the classroom carrying symbols of advancement, only to discover that commerce did not reward scholastic prestige on its own, and that enterprise exposed a man to verdicts no examiner could soften. It was here that Gustave Le Bon introduced one of his most revealing ideas: fear of responsibility. He did not mean simple laziness, nor mere appetite for comfort. He meant an aversion to risk, uncertainty, entrepreneurial exposure, and personal accountability for failure. In trade, in manufacture, in agriculture, in the professions, error could become public humiliation and material ruin. A merchant misread demand and paid in bankruptcy. A manufacturer borrowed badly and watched a factory collapse under debt. A provincial lawyer without clients discovered that a diploma could not command a livelihood. The world outside the office judged without pity, and it judged in cash, reputation, and lost years. The state office offered another moral universe. It rarely promised riches, but it promised something many found more valuable than riches: salary, security, pension, routine, and recognized status. Above all, it offered insulation from the permanent gamble of economic life. The civil servant did not need to win customers every morning or defend every error before creditors by nightfall. Procedure absorbed part of the burden once carried by personal nerve. The office narrowed the field of danger. It replaced improvisation with file, hierarchy, and schedule. For the ambitious mind made anxious by uncertainty, that bargain carried immense force. Le Bon's insight was psychological before it was political. Human beings do not seek only gain. They seek protection from disgrace. In a society where literacy expanded, social ranks loosened, and families sacrificed heavily to educate sons beyond their station, failure acquired a sharper sting. The educated son who returned home without position did not appear merely unlucky. He appeared misfired. Under those conditions, official employment became more than a job. It became a certificate of social legitimacy. The state stamp could settle a question that the market kept reopening: whether a man truly belonged among the respectable. That is why the office became a sanctuary for the demi-savant and for many who feared the exposed life of enterprise. In the French Third Republic and elsewhere, public schooling widened the circle of those who could imagine entering respectable administrative life. But expansion created its own trap. The more certificates society produced, the more candidates pressed toward the same limited doors. Education, instead of dispersing ambition across every field of action, often concentrated it around the state. When the economy could not absorb expectation turned toward ministries, prefectures, rail offices, tax departments, classrooms, and regulated professions tied to official approval. From that pressure emerged a political demand with enormous consequences. More posts were requested, then justified, then normalized. More examinations were organized to regularize entry. More departments appeared to classify, supervise, inspect, and archive. This was not merely an administrative scheme imposed from above by power-hungry officials. It was also a social movement from below, driven by anxious aspirants seeking durable shelter. The clerk state was built not only by rulers who desired instruments of control, but by educated classes who desired refuge from exposure. Here, Le Bon's critique of expanding civil service demand became especially sharp. Fonctionnarism does not simply employ a class. It creates a constituency for its own enlargement. Every new office confirms the prestige of office. Every new examination produces thousands who become emotionally invested in the expansion of official pathways. Every reform meant to make entry fairer also deepens the belief that dignity and security are to be found inside administration rather than beyond it. Bureaucracy, in this sense, is not passive machinery. It is a social magnet. It attracts dependency, then converts dependency into political support. None of this means the offices were useless. Modern states had real work to do. Railways required coordination. Taxes required assessment. Epidemics required surveillance. Cities required sanitation. Armies required records, conscription rolls, and supply systems. Le Bon's target was not administration as such. His target was the point at which a necessary instrument begins to grow under a second logic, no longer driven only by complexity, but by the collective hunger for guaranteed position. Those two motives can coexist for a long time, and they are easy to confuse. One answers the needs of civilization. The other answers the fear of responsibility. Late 19th century Europe made that confusion especially powerful. Old hierarchies had weakened, but stable new ones were not yet secure. Industry generated wealth, volatility, and periodic panic. Social mobility widened hope, yet each widening of hope created a wider field of disappointment. Education elevated ambition faster than economies could satisfy it. Respectability became both more accessible and more fragile. In such a world, the office seemed almost providential. A modest salary instead of speculation, security instead of exposure, a pension instead of anxious old age, and a fixed routine amid social turbulence. But the sanctuary demanded payment. Salary, security, and pension were purchased with loss of initiative. Not always total loss, not always immediate, but loss nonetheless. To enter the office was often to exchange independent risk for regulated survival, the open field for the corridor, self-direction for institutional carriage. That exchange should not be treated as a simple vice. It answered a profound and recurring human need. When societies become unstable, many do not dream first of greatness. They dream of being spared disaster. Once enough people begin to seek that shelter through the state, the search for protection becomes a force in public life. The office seeker may speak in the language of merit, reform, justice, and service, and often with complete sincerity. Yet beneath those noble claims stands a quieter demand, that life be moved from hazard into guarantee. And when that demand is absorbed by the institution, it no longer remains a passing mood. It settles into habit. It becomes a way of seeing risk, authority, obedience, and order. The office first protects a certain kind of character. Then, with time, it helps produce one. Upward, submission. Downward, command. In Le Bon's portrait, that was the inner paradox of the clerkly temperament. The same official who appeared cautious, deferential, and meticulously obedient before a superior could become rigid, cold, and minutely tyrannical before the citizen. This was not simply hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. It was a pattern cultivated by structure. Bureaucracy was never only a mechanism of files and signatures. It was a discipline of the nerves, a training in how to survive inside hierarchy without ever standing exposed before danger. The office rewarded a very specific kind of prudence. A subordinate who acted boldly, interpreted a rule creatively, or accepted personal responsibility for an uncertain decision risked far more than error. He risked visibility, and visibility inside a tightly layered administration could be fatal to advancement. The safer course was almost always procedural retreat. Refer the matter upward, request clarification, demand another signature, cite precedent, delay until the risk had moved elsewhere. Institutions of this kind spoke in the language of duty, but often rewarded something narrower than duty. They rewarded the art of never being the final owner of a dangerous choice. From that pressure, a social type emerged. Toward superiors, the clerk learned ceremony. Speech became careful. Judgment became guarded. Reliability counted for more than brilliance because reliability promised that no disruption would rise unexpectedly through the chain of command. Inside such a world, incompetence could sometimes be forgiven if it remained orderly. Unauthorized initiative was harder to pardon because it threatened the one thing bureaucracies fear most: uncontrolled consequences. The superior, in this sense, was not merely an authority figure. He was also a shield. Deference was a form of self-protection. Toward the public, the emotional geometry changed. The citizen stood outside the protective ladder of the institution. He could be postponed, corrected, redirected, or buried under technicalities at little cost to the department. Here appeared what might be called citizen-facing petty despotism. Not epic cruelty, not dramatic oppression, but the steady rain of small refusals by which official power makes itself felt. Another form, another office, another certification, another return visit, another insistence that the regulation leaves no room. The clerk who trembled upward could harden downward because downward was the safest place to exercise authority. That pattern is more disturbing precisely because it does not require personal wickedness. Many officials sincerely believe they are defending order. The refusal is explained as neutrality. The delay is explained as caution. The coldness is explained as fairness. Yet institutional life can produce hardness without hatred. Sympathy becomes dangerous because sympathy bends a rule, and a bent rule creates a precedent, and a precedent exposes the official who allowed it. So procedure slowly acquires a sacred aura. It becomes not merely a tool of administration, but a moral refuge. If the rule decides no individual must fully carry the burden of the human cost. Le Bon pushed the diagnosis further into a trait that routine-bound systems repeatedly display: the hatred of audacious feats, even the hatred of genius. Exceptional talent unsettles institutions built on regularity. Genius does not move at the approved rhythm, crosses compartments. It reveals by contrast how much of official life depends on repetition rather than insight. The brilliant subordinate is dangerous not only because he may defy precedent, but because his existence silently indicts mediocrity. The daring reformer is dangerous because reform creates uncertainty, enemies, and unforeseen chains of responsibility. In such an atmosphere, extraordinary ability may be praised in speeches and punished in practice. This is where seniority versus merit becomes more than an administrative disagreement. It becomes a philosophy of order. Seniority offers peace. It provides a measurable principle that reduces conflict, limits envy, and keeps promotion from turning into a permanent civil war of evaluations. Merit sounds nobler, but merit demands judgment, and judgment invites dispute. Dispute produces factions. Factions threaten governability. So the institution often drifts toward systems in which time served counts more heavily than force of mind, originality, or audacity. Safe competence outranks creative distinction. Conformity to departmental culture becomes an invisible qualification. What results is homogenization. Not universal stupidity, but a gradual sanding down of sharp edges, difficult talents, and inconvenient brilliance. From the outside, this can look merely tedious. From the inside, it is experienced as necessity. A large machine cannot easily tolerate too many personalities acting as exceptions to rule. Predictability becomes the supreme virtue because predictability keeps the apparatus legible to itself. The file must appear where the file should appear. The memorandum must travel by its proper route. The exception is feared not because it is always wrong, but because every exception threatens to multiply into a breach. Bureaucracy, therefore, tends to prefer the governable over the great, the reliable over the remarkable, the standard over the singular. Le Bon could be excessive, but on this point his insight was sharp. Offices do not merely impose regulations. They cultivate reflexes, the reflex to defer upward, the reflex to dominate downward, the reflex to mistrust audacity, the reflex to protect the routine against the exceptional. Over time, these become a moral atmosphere. New entrants absorb it whether they intended to or not. The humane grow careful, the energetic grow patient, the imaginative learn silence, camouflage, or exit. An institution does not need to command mediocrity openly if its rewards quietly select for it. And once those habits settle into a durable class character, they do not remain confined to desks and corridors. They begin to shape political desire itself. A class formed by administration will often look favorably on a society made more administrative, more supervised, more standardized, more sheltered from uncertainty, more distrustful of unmanaged freedom. Faith in organized oversight, procedural guardianship, and expert direction does not arise from theory alone. It grows out of lived habit. The office, after training men to survive by hierarchy and rule, also trains them to imagine the nation in the image of the department. A temperament formed inside the office rarely agrees to remain confined there. Once a class is trained to trust files over improvisation, committees over personal judgment, and regulated security over hazardous freedom, it begins to look beyond its desks and ledgers and ask why the larger society should not be arranged on the same principles. That was one of Gustave Le Bon's sharpest and most unsettling claims. In The Psychology of Socialism, published in 1898, he treated the bureaucratic mind not simply as a professional habit but as a political appetite. His target was collectivism in a precise sense. He meant the steady transfer of social coordination away from dispersed individuals, firms, guilds, families, and local authorities, and toward central organs acting in the name of the whole. State socialism was narrower still. It meant a regime in which the state becomes the chief manager, regulator, employer, guarantor, and increasingly the moral interpreter of national life. For Le Bon, that prospect held a special attraction for the clerk class because it transformed their preferred environment into an entire social order. A society governed through ministries, commissions, reports, and official permissions was simply the office universalized. The attraction was psychological before it was doctrinal. The office is a world where ambiguity is suspect, spontaneity is supervised, and every difficulty seems to justify another category, another signature, another rule of competence. It rewards minds that prefer life in a form that can be read from above. Markets are unstable. Provinces are stubborn. Voluntary associations multiply in eccentric directions. Independent producers rise and fall without asking permission. But administration imagines a cleaner map. It prefers populations counted, occupations classified, schools standardized, labor inspected, prices observed, conduct recorded. What the merchant experiences as obstruction, the official experiences as intelligibility. What the entrepreneur experiences as suffocation, the planner experiences as order. That is why Le Bon saw an elective affinity between the clerk class and collectivism. Not an iron law, not a secret pact, not a claim that every civil servant dreams of tyranny. His point was more subtle and, for that reason, more durable. A class shaped by routine supervision will often prefer a society in which uncertainty itself is reduced, where social life is increasingly rendered legible through administration. The wider the reach of official management, the less the nation resembles a field of competing wills, and the more it resembles a hierarchy of assigned functions. In that atmosphere, office culture stops being merely a career and starts becoming a model for civilization. Here, Le Bon's imagery becomes especially vivid. He imagined an areopagus of bookish professors and administrators ruling through doctrine, expertise, and decrees, a governing stratum whose confidence rested not on property, military glory, or local authority, but on certification and procedure. The image carries his prejudices plainly enough. It reflects his suspicion of pedagogues, theorists, and men formed more by examination than by action. Yet the strategic insight beneath the rhetoric remains difficult to dismiss. When public authority shifts toward inspectors, boards, commissions, credentialed experts, and permanent offices, the nation begins to absorb the moral logic of the department. In Le Bon's phrase and spirit, it risks becoming a single vast department. The distinction matters because the argument is often flattened into caricature. Not every socialist movement was bureaucratic in origin, and not every bureaucracy is socialist. 19th century socialism was a crowded and conflicted world. It included revolutionary workers, Christian reformers, syndicalists hostile to the central state, municipal idealists, trade unionists, and Marxists who regarded bureaucracy as a disguise for class domination rather than a path to justice. At the same time, empires, monarchies, and liberal republics built formidable bureaucracies while rejecting socialist doctrine outright. Administrative expansion was not the monopoly of one ideology. It was one of the defining temptations of modern statecraft itself. So Le Bon's argument is strongest when treated not as identity, but as affinity. Bureaucratic minds often find collectivist systems congenial because those systems dignify supervision, enlarge official careers, and elevate management into a public virtue. State socialism, in particular, can offer the administrative class more than employment. It offers mission. The clerk ceases to be a subordinate custodian of paperwork and becomes an instrument of social rationalization, a custodian not merely of files, but of the national future as officially defined. That is a powerful transformation, because it wraps appetite in moral language. Still, history does not permit the easy satisfaction of blaming everything on clerks and professors. The legitimacy of labor regulation, public sanitation, pension systems, compulsory insurance, housing oversight, and food inspection did not emerge from fantasy. Industrial Europe generated suffering on a scale earlier political orders had scarcely confronted. Children bent into factory discipline, cities swollen beyond inherited habits of health, epidemics moving through crowded districts, injuries treated as private ruin, and wages exposed to violent fluctuations. Under those conditions, demands for intervention gained authority because laissez-faire often looked less like liberty than organized indifference. That is where a revealing contrast appears. Later thinkers such as Max Weber would treat rational administration as an unavoidable instrument of mass society, a hard framework imposed by scale, complexity, and technical necessity. Le Bon saw that necessity as well, but he insisted on something else: the desire that attaches itself to administration, the emotional and social satisfaction that expansion offers to classes seeking status, security, and control. One perspective explains why large societies build machinery. The other explains why that machinery keeps gathering admirers long after necessity has done its work. Both insights belong to the story. Modern taxation, rail systems, schools, and public health regimes required organization far beyond the habits of the village and the court. Yet once that machinery exists, it rarely remains neutral. It attracts ambition. It trains expectation. It teaches whole strata of society to believe that every disorder yields to another regulation, another bureau, another layer of oversight. Collectivism, then, is not only an economic arrangement. It becomes a habit of mind, a conviction that the nation is safest when social life is made administratively legible. And once that conviction hardens, the decisive matter is no longer preference, but power. How a class devoted to administration turns its taste for supervision into effective rule beneath institutions that still speak in the language of popular sovereignty. Desire becomes power at the point where institutions learn how to outlast the men sent to direct them. That is the hinge of the whole drama. Constitutions, parliamentary speeches, and cabinet announcements suggest that authority lives where public attention is focused. They point upward toward ministers, assemblies, presidents, prime ministers. But government is not exercised only where decisions are proclaimed. It is exercised where decisions are translated into language precise enough to bind, flexible enough to evade, and durable enough to survive the next political storm. In modern states, that labor belongs less to the transient ruler than to the permanent office. This is the state within a state. Not a hidden cult, not a theatrical conspiracy, but a permanent apparatus with its own memory, interests, solidarities, and procedural monopolies operating beneath changing governments. Elections alter the rhetoric of power. Administrations alter its face. Yet the archive remains, the department remains, the career official remains, and with them remain the habits by which policy is filtered into reality. A minister enters office with a mandate and an agenda. The department receives him with files, precedents, technical definitions, pending litigation, budget constraints, internal customs, and a quiet confidence born of survival. The office has endured stronger personalities than this one. It assumes, usually correctly, that it will still be there after the slogans have passed. That asymmetry matters because modern rule is inseparable from execution, and execution is the source of real power. A principle announced in public means almost nothing until someone drafts the circular, assigns the personnel, interprets the exceptions, chooses the timeline, and decides which office must sign first. By then, authority has already changed hands. The politician may set direction in theory, but the administrator determines how that direction is broken into stages, where friction is introduced, which risks are emphasized, and what the command will mean when it reaches ordinary life. Between decision and consequence stands an entire structure of interpretation. That structure is rarely neutral. It has preferences. It has fears. It has instincts of self-protection. The conflict between the unitary executive and permanent administration begins there. The nominal sovereign commands, the administrative machine disposes. One speaks in the language of initiative. The other governs through sequence. One is visible and therefore blamed. The other is obscure and therefore durable. Even a capable minister depends on subordinates for 1,000 invisible judgments. whether a reform can be implemented immediately or must wait for consultation, whether a phrase violates precedent, whether a legal objection is fatal or merely inconvenient, whether the policy should be narrowed before publication in the name of prudence. Complexity makes such dependence unavoidable. Yet once dependence becomes habitual, expertise becomes leverage, and leverage hardens into authority. The permanent official enjoys advantages that politics almost never grants to elected leaders. Time is one of them. A minister may control a portfolio for a year, sometimes only months. A senior civil servant may dominate the same domain for decades. Memory is another. The politician remembers promises. The department remembers failures, compromises, rival agencies, hostile judges, buried reports, and the exact wording that caused disaster 15 years earlier. Then there is procedure, which to the public appears as method, but within the institution functions as terrain. A department that wishes to resist does not need to rebel. It can request clarification, demand another review, elevate a technical concern, circulate for comment, await legal assessment, and ask whether implementation should be phased to avoid unforeseen complications. Delay is often more powerful than refusal because delay preserves obedience in form while nullifying it in substance. Here Le Bon's formula lands with ruthless clarity. The weaker the government, the stronger the bureaucracy. Weak cabinets, divided parliaments, unstable coalitions, and rapid ministerial turnover all enlarge the practical sovereignty of the permanent administration. A fragile government cannot master its departments before it begins to fall apart. A legislature split into factions can produce broad declarations but not sustained supervision. In that vacuum, the office becomes the only element capable of continuity. At first, this seems merely useful. Then it becomes indispensable. Finally, it becomes dominant. The bureaucracy does not need a coup because it has a subtler weapon than force. It remains seated while elected authority rotates around it. This was especially potent in the great administrative states of modern Europe, where industrial society multiplied functions faster than political institutions could digest them. Railways, taxation, public health, schooling, labor inspection, colonial management, policing, welfare administration, and statistical reporting all thickened the web of expertise. The department could then claim, often truthfully, that only it understood the consequences of change. From that claim emerges a dangerous moral transformation. The permanent office ceases to think of itself as merely an instrument. It begins to see itself as the rational guardian of the state against amateurism, passion, and electoral volatility. In that moment, service shades into tutelage. Corporate self-defense follows almost automatically. It rarely appears as open revolt. It appears as obstruction, procedural slowdown, selective leakage, internal solidarity, and collective resistance to reform. A hostile department can implement a policy so narrowly that it fails, then present the failure as proof of its own earlier wisdom. An unwelcome minister can be isolated through dependence on briefings prepared by those who oppose his aims. An outsider can be exhausted by detail until ambition collapses into caution. None of this requires villainy in the melodramatic sense. It requires only an institution conscious of its own continuity and determined to protect the conditions of that continuity. And so sovereignty shifts without ceremony. No throne is overturned. No constitution is formally annulled. The minister retains title, the parliament retains dignity, the executive retains legal command. Yet beneath those forms, the permanent administration accumulates what matters most: memory, implementation, delay, interpretation, and endurance. That is the true meaning of a state within a state. The ruler of the modern order is often not the one who announces policy, but the one who decides what policy becomes when it enters the bloodstream of procedure. The deepest consequence of this administrative triumph is not merely that ministries expand or procedures multiply. It is that a civilization can begin to reorganize its moral instincts around management itself. Le Bon feared fonctionnarism because he believed it reshaped character before it reshaped constitutions. A people slowly accustomed to filing, petitioning, waiting, and complying may come to prefer shelter over initiative, permission over action, and procedural innocence over the burden of judgment. Fear of responsibility, in that sense, is no longer just the weakness of an office seeker. It becomes a civilizational temptation. Freedom remains praised in public language, while in private habits a safer ideal takes root: to be protected, processed, and relieved of the full risk of deciding. In calm periods, that bargain can look almost rational. The administrative order appears competent because routine is its native element. Forms are completed, revenues are collected, disputes are categorized, standards are applied, records accumulate. From the outside, this creates the impression of a society well governed, because ordinary life is full of repetitive problems, and repetition is exactly what bureaucracy handles best. But history does not reserve its judgment for ordinary conditions. It tests nations through shocks. War compresses time. Epidemics punish delay. Financial panic exposes hidden fragilities. Technological upheaval ruins assumptions faster than committees can revise them. In those moments, the decisive quality is not procedural elegance but adaptive vitality. A system trained above all to minimize error can drift into a deeper failure. It postpones decisive action until the cost of caution becomes catastrophic. That is how decadence can arrive without spectacle. Not always through corruption. Not always through naked tyranny. Often through inertia dignified as prudence. Delay acquires the language of responsibility. Fragmentation hides behind consultation. Accountability dissolves across offices until authority exists everywhere on paper and nowhere in fact. A highly administered society may possess immense information and still lack nerve. It may generate assessments faster than responses, directives faster than decisions, and explanations faster than remedies. The paper sovereign then reveals its central paradox. The more completely it maps society, the more brittle it can become when reality moves faster than the map. Le Bon saw that danger sharply, but he did not see everything clearly. His conservative bias was real. His suspicion of mass democracy often became excessive. His language about national character could harden fluid social conditions into something like destiny. His confidence in psychological types was sometimes greater than the evidence could bear. He could speak as though the whole drama of modern politics could be reduced to clerks, crowds, and instincts. That goes too far. Industrial society did place genuine burdens on states. Urban disease was real. Labor conflict was real. Illiteracy, sanitation crises, railway coordination, taxation at scale, and the administration of mass politics were not fantasies invented by officials in search of employment. From another angle, thinkers such as Max Weber understood rational administration not merely as decline, but as a structural necessity of modern magnitude. That correction matters because the alternative to bad administration is not automatically liberty, and still less civilization. Archives matter. Regulators matter. Public health administrations matter. Technical agencies matter. A large society cannot endure on charisma, improvisation, and noble slogans alone. The real issue is proportion. The real issue is accountability. The real issue is whether administration remains the servant of political life or becomes its quiet master. Whether expertise informs judgment or replaces it. Whether permanent administration strengthens a unitary executive and representative institutions, or quietly teaches them dependence until elected authority becomes ceremonial and execution becomes sovereign. The modern verdict, then, is neither simple condemnation nor comfortable praise. Bureaucracy gave modern states reach, continuity, memory, legibility, and scale. Those are not trivial achievements. Yet the same machinery can dull initiative, reward caution above excellence, and filter out the audacious spirit that civilizations need when conditions change. The cost is rarely paid in one dramatic seizure of power. It is paid in habits, in the steady promotion of the manageable over the exceptional, in the suspicion cast on genius because genius is disruptive, in the gradual belief that a stamped approval is morally superior to a difficult freedom. That is the true strength of the paper's sovereign. It does not merely govern institutions. It answers a longing within society itself. And the form has not vanished with paper. The file cabinet becomes the database. The stamp becomes the portal. The corridor outside the ministry becomes the algorithmic queue. Power is encountered less as a visible ruler than as a process, a dashboard, a compliance pathway, a technical system whose decisions are difficult to inspect and even harder to challenge. Digital speed does not abolish the old question of sovereignty. It intensifies it. An impersonal order can become more powerful, not less, when its commands arrive frictionlessly and its logic is hidden behind expertise, automation, and code. So Le Bon's enduring value lies not in prophecy, and not in a program, but in diagnosis. He recognized that societies often surrender character gradually, not because they are conquered outright, but because they are offered security, predictability, and moral relief from the burden of choosing. That bargain is ancient. Modern administration simply perfected its machinery. The final issue is not whether order is necessary. It is whether protection preserves civic strength or quietly replaces it. If this investigation has earned a place in the archive, subscribe for more long-form histories of power, strategy, and the hidden habits that shape civilizations. Continue with the video on the end screen, where this pattern appears again in another form. And for the comments, keep it simple. Servant or sovereign? Which word describes modern administration more accurately?